Okay, looks like the film started all right. That was one of the crew pictures we took that kind of said what everybody was going to do on the mission, pretty much. You can only show leaving the crew quarters so many times and get something new out of it, and there's nothing new here except the sun was going down by the time we got out of there because we were going to launch at 7:30 in the evening down there at the Cape. It was a great day, beautiful clear sky, and by the time we got ready for launch, though, it was pretty dark. So it makes the things like engine light-off sequence pretty spectacular to see it at the night. The engines worked fine, and the orbiter worked fine, and we went right down through the count very clean, and at 29 minutes after 7 in the evening, those solids lit, and we left. It was a pretty spectacular sight, we're told. People saw it as far north as Carolinas and all the way down the south end of Florida and beyond. It was a great ride from where we were sitting. There was a lot of light. We were immersed in a field of light all the way through ascent up till we got off the solid or the tank after our main engine cut off. But gee, it was a real nice ride, smooth ride once you got off the solids, and just a real nice push all the way up to MECO. Bryan, why don't you tell them about the rest of it?
Well, not only was it bright inside the cockpit, but these people who were about 3 miles away had all their faces lit up. It looked like we were headed towards the moon, and that's what it looked like to us as well in the cockpit. For about 3 minutes or so, every time I'd look up, I'd see the moon right in the center of my front window. We couldn't see any stars or the horizon, though, because of the glow all around the cockpit from the big fire behind us. We're coming up on solid rocket booster separation here. This is my first flight. I don't know what it looks or feels like in the daytime, but at night it was spectacular. A great big orange flame enveloped the whole front end of the vehicle when the solids separated. Of course, the G level went down from about 2.5 Gs to 1 G, and then from then on it was one continuous long push all the way to orbit. The first daytime scene that we saw once we got on orbit and came out of the Terminator here was Northwest Australia. Became pretty familiar with Australia. We saw it every day during the morning passes. Although this picture was shot a little later in the mission, it does show you what the cockpit arrangement was like. Of course, we had changed clothes after ascent and got down to business here. We were checking out instruments. In this particular case, the instruments in the front part of the cockpit. As is the commander's prerogative, he occasionally would inspect the ship, and we'll take you on a little tour here. He went down one of the interdeck accesses in a way that you can only do on orbit, and went down to see how the two payload specialists were doing in the middeck. We're coming right down on top of one of the experiments here as it leaves the lower part of the screen. That was the DMOS experiment that Mary will talk about later. You see Rodolfo Neri there, who was contemplating his experiments and the successes he'd been having during the day as he floated in zero gravity, and of course Charlie in the corner.
In the first 3 days we had to launch 3 satellites, so we didn't have too much time to enjoy the view right off the bat. We had to get ready to deploy. By the 6th orbit we had Morelos ready to go. Here you see the Morelos spinning at 50 revolutions per minute, leaving the payload bay. It leaves with a resounding thump, and we watched that track very smoothly and beautifully into the distance. After the Morelos deploy, we had another day before we had the next deploy, and Rodolfo took plenty of that opportunity to go ahead and take pictures of his homeland. This is Jerry Ross in the front seat now, and myself in the back, getting ready to deploy the SATCOM. Here you can see SATCOM. It's a different geometric shape than the Morelos. And again, as you watch that leave the payload bay, you can see it's a nice, smooth departure, and everything looks to be going just fine. We also deployed OSAT on day 2, but the OSAT deploy was a night deploy, and we weren't able to get good photographs of that being in the dark. Here you can see the SATCOM again going away against the Earth's horizon. Now, after each and every satellite deploy, we have to do an ohms burn for separation so that we'll be at a safe distance from the satellite when it fires its kick motor. Here we can see the left ohms engine burn. And that's just the startup. The burn lasts for a little while. And this is what it looks like in the middeck. Jerry made it right into the airlock, and we collected all those pieces.
The McDonnell Douglas electrophoresis work on this flight involved this large cabinet of apparatus, including the separation chamber itself, purifying pharmaceutical or medical materials. Our material that we are interested in as our first commercial material is called erythropoietin, a drug that we hope to have available for use to fight anemia, among other illnesses. Extraction of a sample of the purified portion of that material could be done via a syringe, as you see me doing here. I could then use that syringe in a small chemistry set type arrangement of equipment to verify the purity of that material being separated in the device in front of me in this picture.
This is Jerry and I discussing the next day's plans to go EVA or take our spacewalk. We'd done a lot of water tank work, and we did a lot more talking on orbit before we went out.
One of the Mexican experiments consisted in observing the way that plants transport their nutrients. And I used bromophenol blue dye on the leaf of each plant and a saffronin dye on the root of the same plant, letting both dyes to be absorbed by each plant and then cutting the stems into different segments to be analyzed further in Mexico City by the PIs who proposed this from the National University of Mexico.
I was real happy to get a chance to look at the globe from orbit. Being an environmental type, it was a great treat. We got to eat Thanksgiving dinner together on orbit, which was a real different Thanksgiving dinner than I'd ever had before. Here's Charlie starting off with shrimp cocktail. Of course, Rodolfo was serious as usual. We never laughed at each other when we sort of made little mistakes. Seating at dinner of seven is a little different in space because, as you can see, you can sit on a wall, sit on the floor, and also sit on the ceiling. We had irradiated turkey out of little green bags, same color as U.S. Army eats, I believe, Woody. And it was actually pretty good. You had to be a little careful to keep the fluid on the turkey. We had fresh bread. We had the treat of having tortillas on orbit, probably because Rodolfo was there, and we found out that they are by far preferable to bread making sandwiches when there's no gravity. We ate cranberry sauce from the same company that everybody else did, and there was the boss sort of overseeing our dinner, and Jerry sort of topped off the dinner table by sitting on the ceiling over there.
This is Brewster and Bryan and Mary in the flight deck. They're preparing for the first of the two spacewalks. This doesn't show it, but they had a real plethora of cameras in the aft flight deck, and you'll see some examples of that later on. Meanwhile, Woody and I were down in the mid-deck, and we're preparing our 35mm cameras to go outside. We had to put some special covers on them to protect them thermally and to set up the lenses properly. Mid-deck gets pretty crowded when we have the third EMU out there in the mid-deck and both of us are trying to get into our suits. It's a lot easier, I think, to get into the suits in 0G than it was in 1G. You can see me entering into the hatch there, going into the airlock, and Woody is to follow here. And Bryan was our IVA aide-de-camp helping us get suited up, and he did a super job. You can see us squirming, trying to get up into our hard upper torsos, which formed the upper half of our suits. The first time we got in the suits, it was a pretty tight fit, but by the time we got them into them on the second EVA, it was a much smoother ingress into the suits. I think partially because we had press fit them to our form on the first EVA. This is Brewster in the aft flight deck. He was keeping a close eye on us at all times. Besides operating the cameras, he was making sure that we weren't going to get into any trouble. This is a good view of us performing the access build. This is Woody with his back to us in the front foot restraint, and I'm facing the cabin in the back. We had just completed one bay of the access truss, and we are starting to take components out to start another bay. That served us very well. The access went essentially as we had seen it on the ground. There was no surprises. Here you can see a view out one of the overhead windows in the cockpit as the truss nears completion. It was a total of 45 feet long, and the three of us, Mary, Woody, and myself, dubbed ourselves the Ace Construction Company with the supporting crew of the rest of the crew, and we put up our advertisement after we'd completed the construction of the first access truss. Our motto is, we'll build a suit anywhere, and we'd be happy to do that again anytime.
As you can see here, I was flying the arm, looking in the upper overhead window. You can sort of see Jerry doing his Superman imitation there. after working a lot of hours in a simulator flying Captain Cardboard around, it was really a treat to be able to give these guys a ride. And they were real cooperative, giving me great GCAs. Here you can see them saluting a flag up on the MFR, which was really fun to see. Here, Jerry is demonstrating running a cable, like if you were going to run an electrical cable in a space station. I just took him straight up the structure and straight down again. We did notice a couple inches drift at that point in time. I'll tell you, before I was taking these guys out, and here they're doing a build a Bay 10, it was really funny. They sat down in the airlock for about 40 minutes and just really pumped me up, talking about what a great guy I was, until I got them flailing around on the end of the arm, and it was really a good time. The arm flies wonderfully. It's just such a great tool. Real smooth and no surprises. And the most amazing thing for me was watching him pick up this thing, which was the equivalent of a 4-story building, this truss, access truss, and just twirl it around with very little effort, and it imparted very little motion into the arm. I expected more arm dynamics, and we didn't get it. So all in all, it was a lot of fun being able to interact with them, and they gave me some real good directions while we were up there.
Well, this next sequence was a set of special filming that was done for data collection on the construction of the EASE hardware. This was shot at 6 frames per second, and we're showing it to you at 24 frames per second, so that accounts for the slightly Keystone Cop effect that you're seeing. The person that was working in the foot restraint, and in this case it happens to be Woody, had a pretty good workstation, and even though he was very busy, he felt fairly comfortable with his work. I was free-floating for this build, and as you'll see, we'll both go up and take the next beam up together. That also seemed fairly comfortable, we thought, being able to have one person on each end of the beam. The beam was controllable, and it wasn't an excessive amount of hand strength required to maintain body position and to align the beam for attachment. By the way, this I think was the 8th of the 8 builds we did of EASE on the first of the 2 EVAs, and we were felt pretty well up the learning curve by that time, and I think that accounts for the smoothness with which the assembly went on this particular time.
Relatively smooth.
Relatively smooth. Our hands by this time were getting relatively tired. The suit with the body inside it weighed in the neighborhood of 400 to 450 pounds. The beams each weighed 60 pounds or so. And when you're trying to maintain your body position and still torque those tubes around and then line them and attach them, it gets your hands fatigued rather rapidly. This is probably not the preferred way of assembling a space station. Something more akin to access where the crew members are stationary in foot restraints is preferred. But for certain applications, I think we've demonstrated that crew free-floating, especially if you have a crew member on each end of a beam, is certainly an adequate way to do certain types of construction in limited applications. You can see me kicking my heels together there at the end of the last build.
This shows me starting to pick up these. On the second EVA, we constructed them again, and then we were able to release them and manipulate them. And this shows me manipulating the entire EASE structure. Now that structure weighs about 400 pounds on Earth, and the center of gravity of it is about 6 feet in front of me. Jerry and I both had the opportunity to manipulate this, and again, it was very easy to do. We could just run it end over end from side to side. As long as we kept the rates down fairly slow, it was not a problem at all. After we were done doing this, we were able to reinsert it right into the socket that it came from, which required accuracy down to the centimeter level, and it was not a particular problem. Now, we did run into a problem during the flight in that we could not replace a very simple pip pin, and that gave us about a 30-second consternation. Then we decided to go ahead and move over to the next rack of clusters and just continue on with the EVA. While we were on orbit, we also had another job, which is really not hard at all, and that's to look at the Earth. And that's probably the most fun part of all. This shows us just coming over the Baja and crossing the Baja into mainland Mexico, where Rodolfo was able to take many, many pictures, and he is extremely, and so are all the Earth observation people, pleased with the results. Here he knows he's got another winner. Good picture. Now this shows us coming down off the Red Sea. In this picture you can see the Nile, the Sinai Peninsula, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Suez, along with the Arabian Desert. This area was not an area that we were able to see most of the time, so that's very special to us to even have this picture. By the way, north is pointing on the bottom of the picture, or south is to the top. Mary took most of these motion picture Earth views that we've got, and this is one way she did it. Another one was to have a special bracket that literally held the camera to the window and take the photos. For this particular photo, we're coming off the Atlantic Ocean and coming onto the west coast of Africa. We're just north of Dakar, entering the Western Sahara. This is an area that in past flights had been particularly dusty due to all the dust storms and the crop burning that they had done in the past, but again, we were quite lucky in getting some very pretty and good visibility shots.
Well, it's all good things that come to an end too soon, and here's a picture of Charlie and Rodolfo down in the middeck during re-entry phase of the mission. I stood up for a good share of the mission and took some pictures out the aft overhead windows, and you can see some of the plasma recombination effect in the wake of the orbiter as we start to re-enter the Earth's upper atmosphere. Picture of Brewster and Bryan as they're monitoring the vehicle.
This was our first roll maneuver, about Mach 24 times the speed of sound. You can see we rolled up on the wing to about 90 degrees of bank angle. And again, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you can see that plasma recombination. It was a bright orange glow, just like on a match or in your fireplace. It stuck with us for quite a while.
We see the same view here that you do from 200 miles, only now we're down to 250 or 240,000 feet, and you're still going just as fast as you were. So it looks like you're really screaming in right on top of the clouds. The vehicle knew exactly what to do. It's a great guidance system, and it did everything exactly right all the way down. We had a real smooth ride. We didn't encounter any turbulence in the upper atmosphere. Charlie and Rodolfo enjoyed the ride down. I think it was a very pleasant experience.
When we crossed the west coast, we were at Ventura there, and that's the city you see, Ventura and Oxnard. As we rolled for the last roll maneuver, right at the end of this scene, you can see the clouds as they came up across the mountains and were over the desert area.
As we turn on to final, we could finally see the runway environment at Edwards, and not until we started turning on to final. As we rolled out onto the final approach, there was some clouds in front of us. We have two aim points out there, a nominal and a close-in aim point. We were supposed to be going to the nominal. It was behind the clouds. We could only see a little bit of the close-in aim point. But the heads-up display showed us that our navigation and guidance systems were doing very well. And so we could use them to point ourselves at the ground until we broke out of the clouds and then could see the aim points underneath. Pre-flare and everything after that went nominally. Bryan put the gear down at about 300 feet. Right on the money, and the rest of it's history. It's pretty much from here on just like landing any glider or any airplane with the power pulled back. We landed, as you know, on the concrete Edwards 22 runway out there. I guess we were about 2,500 feet down the runway or so, and 190 knots at touchdown, and the rest of the rollout went pretty nominally.
As the nose comes down there, you can see the speed brake is full out. We had very little crosswind and about 5 knots of tailwind on this landing. This is a shot that Jerry got by placing that same camera that he had used up earlier in entry into the side hatch window. And you can see just as the nose is coming down how fast it looks like we're going down the runway. It's quite a bit faster than you would see out your window on an airliner. Touchdown is over 200 miles per hour, and at this point with the nose on the ground we're about 190 miles per hour. Brewster began braking about 130 miles an hour, and he'll go into that.
It's a nice long runway, so we didn't need to get on the brakes very hard. We didn't put much energy into them, and consequently, when the folks looked at the wheels, brakes, and tires after landing rollout, they were all in pretty good shape. So they were able to tow the vehicle right off the runway and get Edwards back into flying operations as soon as they could. You'll see us come down the steps here, and it's pretty remarkable, I think, how well everyone looks. Everybody's in really good shape. We all felt real good getting back into 1G. Didn't have any adverse conditions from the 7 days in 0G, and everybody was pretty excited and real pleased with the way the whole thing had gone. The
vehicle when the solids separated. Of course, the G level went down from about 2.5 Gs to 1 G, and then from then on it was one continuous long push all the way to orbit. The first daytime scene that we saw once we got on orbit and came out of the Terminator here was Northwest Australia. Became pretty familiar with Australia. We saw it every day during the morning passes. Although this picture was shot a little later in the mission, it does show you what the cockpit arrangement was like. Of course, we had changed clothes after ascent and got down to business here. We were checking out instruments, in this particular case, the instruments in the front part of the cockpit. As is the commander's prerogative, he occasionally would inspect the ship, and we'll take you on a little tour here. He went down one of the interdeck accesses in a way that you can only do on orbit, and went down to see how the two payload specialists were doing in the middeck. We're coming right down on top of one of the experiments here as it leaves the lower part of the screen. That was the DMOS experiment that Mary will talk about later. You see Rodolfo Neri there.
It worked fine, and we went right down through the count very clean, and at 29 minutes after 7 in the evening, those solids lit and we left. It was a pretty spectacular sight, we're told. People saw it as far north as Carolinas and all the way down the south end of Florida and beyond. It was a great ride from where we were sitting. There was a lot of light. We were immersed in a field of light all the way through ascent up till we got off the tank after a main engine cut off. But gee, it was a real nice ride, smooth ride once you got off the solids, and just a real nice push all the way up to MECO. Okay, looks like the film started all right. That was one of the crew pictures we took that kind of said what everybody was going to do on the mission, pretty much. You can only show leaving the crew quarters so many times and get something new out of it, and there's nothing new here except the sun was going down by the time we got out of there, because we were going to launch at 7:30 in the evening down there at the Cape. It was a great day, beautiful clear sky, and by the time we got ready for launch, though, it was pretty dark. So it makes things like the engine light-off sequence pretty spectacular to see it at the night. The engines worked fine, and orbit. Bryan, why don't you tell them about the rest of it?
Well, not only was it bright inside the cockpit, but these people who were about 3 miles away had all their faces lit up. It looked like we were headed towards the moon, and that's what it looked like to us as well in the cockpit. For about 3 minutes or so, every time I'd look up, I'd see the moon right in the center of my front window. We couldn't see any stars or the horizon, though, because of the glow all around the cockpit from the big fire behind us. We're coming up on solid rocket booster separation here. This is my first flight. I don't know what it looks or feels like in the daytime, but at night it was spectacular. A great big orange flame enveloped the whole front end of the